Welcome to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we drift slowly through the quiet, painful memory of a day that changed everything. A morning that began with coffee and commutes and ended in silence, fire and falling ash. This is the story of September 11th, 2001. Not told with urgency, not with alarm, but gently, as if whispered in the soft light of early dawn. One moment at a time. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and let us begin. It began like any other Tuesday. The skies above the eastern United States were unusually clear. What pilots call severe clear, a kind of perfect blue that stretches unbroken from horizon to horizon. The late summer air carried the crispness of early fall, and in New York City, the streets were already alive before the sun rose over the East River. People were waking up, brewing coffee, buttoning shirts, tying ties, and herding children out the door. Radios muttered in the background. Alarm clocks blinked. Elevators hummed. Newspapers flopped onto doorsteps. The world felt ordinary. In Lower Manhattan, the twin towers of the World Trade Center caught the early light and shimmered faintly, their steel and glass reflecting the sunrise like mirrors. Each stood over 1,300 feet tall, towering above the city like sentinels. Built in the 1970s, the towers were icons of ambition, hated by some, admired by others, but undeniably part of the city's skyline and identity. Inside the North Tower One World Trade Center, thousands of workers were beginning their day. Bankers, brokers, secretaries, janitors. Some arrived early for meetings. Others stepped off elevators sipping coffee from corner carts. Many more were still on the subway, the ferry, or stuck in traffic. The South Tower, 2 World Trade Center, bustled just as much. In a few short minutes, both buildings would be nearly full. Their windows overlooked the harbor, the bridges, the Statue of Liberty. Planes passed overhead, as they always did. Commercial flights, charting predictable paths between cities, anonymous in the sky. In Washington, D.C., government workers filtered into offices in the Pentagon. Children shuffled into classrooms. Tourists snapped pictures along the National Mall, unaware of what the morning would bring. Across the country, in Chicago, Dallas, Los Angeles, the day had barely begun, and in the air 4 flights took off. American Airlines Flight 11 left Boston at 7:59 a.m., bound for Los Angeles. A routine flight, but in its cabin were 5 hijackers who, not long after takeoff, seized control of the aircraft. United Airlines Flight 175 departed from Boston at 8:14 a.m. Just 15 minutes later, also heading to Los Angeles, 5 more hijackers. Another transcontinental flight, heavy with fuel. American Airlines Flight 77 left Washington Dulles Airport at 8:20 a.m. Flight 93 left Newark at 8:42 a.m. The clock was ticking. Back in New York, traffic crawled down Canal Street. Kids waited for school buses. Morning DJs cracked jokes. Somewhere in the city, someone overslept. Someone forgot their briefcase. Someone stopped for a bagel and was running late. Little delays that, on any other day, would mean nothing. But this was not any other day. At 8:46 a.m., in the calm of an otherwise ordinary morning, American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. Just a deafening roar, a flash, and then a shudder that moved through the steel skeleton of the building like a tremor of the earth. The plane hit between floors 93 and 99, tearing through the facade at a steep angle. Jet fuel exploded upon impact, igniting a fireball that sent flames bursting out from both sides of the tower. Debris, metal, glass, paper, smoke, rained down upon the streets below. Those closest to the tower heard it first as a strange thud, followed by car alarms and screaming. Others looked up from sidewalks and taxicabs, unsure of what they were seeing. A hole massive, black, jagged, now gaped in the side of the North Tower. At first, many assumed it was an accident, a small plane, perhaps, a tragic error, a malfunction. But those inside the building knew better. On the upper floors, just above the impact zone, people were trapped. Stairwells had collapsed. Smoke filled the hallways. Lights flickered. Phones stopped working. It was dark. It was hot. It was quiet except for distant alarms and the occasional burst of static from fire alarms. Below the strike, others were already of. Thousands began their descent, winding down endless staircases in orderly lines. Some were barefoot, having kicked off heels or dress shoes. Some helped the elderly or injured. Others called loved ones. Not to say goodbye. Not yet, but simply to say they were okay. On the street, chaos began to ripple outward. First responders arrived within minutes. NYPD, FD, NY, EMTS. Trained, seasoned, and determined. Fire trucks screamed toward lower Manhattan. Police officers began cordoning off streets. News helicopters circled above. The city was watching. And then, at 9:03 a.m., less than 17 minutes after the first plane, the second arrived. United Airlines Flight 175 banked left over the harbor and slammed into the South Tower at approximately the 77th to 85th floors. This time, there was no ambiguity, no assumption of accident. The impact was caught live on television. Broadcasters who had been speculating about a possible aviation mistake were suddenly silenced. Anchors gasped. Viewers at home stared in disbelief. 2 towers, 2 planes, 2 infernos, and everything changed. The second strike confirmed what many were too stunned to say out loud. America was under attack. Within seconds, the South Tower erupted into smoke and flame, debris cascading down. Office papers floated through the sky like confetti from a dark parade. The blue of the sky was now broken by black plumes. The towers, iconic symbols of the city, now looked like smoking chimneys, alive with fire, groaning under weight, defiant and doomed. Inside both towers, the situation grew more desperate. People above the impact zones were stranded. Helicopters circled overhead but could not land. The fires were too intense, smoke too thick, the rooftop doors locked, as per standard fire policy, and escape routes destroyed. The windows of the towers were not designed to open. The heat inside climbed, smoke coiled in the corners of ceilings, and then, slowly, people began making impossible decisions. Some broke windows, others climbed onto ledges, some called loved ones, whispering that they loved them. Some simply waited, and others jumped. From high above, one after another, figures could be seen falling, alone, silhouetted against the towers. This moment, perhaps more than any other, captured the unfathomable reality of what was happening. People were choosing how to die, and below, those who could still move. Firefighters, security guards, civilians, continued the evacuation. Upward and downward, in stairwells choked with smoke. The elevators were dead. Radios crackled with confusion. No one was certain what to expect next. At the same time, in Washington, D.C., the Pentagon braced for something. No one knew what. Not yet. But in New York, the truth was dawning. This wasn't just a disaster. This was war. While New York burned and the world watched, the nation's capital stirred in uneasy confusion. In Washington, D.C., the Pentagon loomed just across the Potomac River, the sprawling nerve center of the U.S. military. With its 5 concentric rings and endless corridors, the building housed over 20,000 people on any given workday. Civilian employees, military officers, contractors, and secretaries alike. As the twin towers were struck, confusion rippled through the halls of power. Television screens flickered. Phones rang with static. People paused in hallways, glancing at news tickers and muttering phrases like accident and air traffic control failure. Even among the nation's top defense officials, the situation felt unthinkable, but the unthinkable had not finished. At 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77, hijacked shortly after takeoff from Washington Dulles, came roaring low over Arlington, Virginia. Some witnesses thought it was a military jet. Others ducked, confused by its speed and silence. Then, without hesitation, it struck. The plane crashed into the western side of the Pentagon at over 500 miles per hour, carving through layers of concrete, steel, and limestone. A fireball erupted. Windows shattered. Walls buckled inward. A section of the building collapsed as smoke rose into the DC sky. Inside, chaos unfolded in seconds. Hallways that had just moments before echoed with footsteps now burned with jet fuel. Firefighters rushed in, dragging hoses through blinding smoke. Staff evacuated in confusion, helping each other through darkened corridors. The building's vastness, once an asset of defense, now made it hard to know what had happened. The Pentagon, symbol of military order, was now a scene of devastation. Elsewhere in D.C., the federal government was already moving into high alert. Secret Service agents rushed Vice President Dick Cheney into a secure underground bunker. Capitol Hill went into lockdown. Fighter jets were scrambled. The White House was partially evacuated. There were unconfirmed reports of more planes, one of them still in the air. Air traffic controllers across the country were sounding alarms, something unprecedented was happening. A full national ground stop. For the first time in US history, all civilian aircraft were ordered to land immediately. Dozens, then hundreds of planes began descending into the nearest airports. Skies emptied. Silence filled the air where jet noise had always been taken for granted. And yet, one plane still flew. United Airlines Flight 93 had departed from Newark just before 9 a.m., bound for San Francisco. On board were 40 people, passengers and crew. The hijacking occurred later than the others. At 9:28 a.m., nearly a full hour into the national emergency. But by then, the passengers were no longer clueless. Many had seen the news on seatback phones. They knew about New York, they knew about the Pentagon, and they began to understand this flight wasn't going to San Francisco. A group of passengers, Todd Beamer, Tom Burnett, Jeremy Glick, and others, began making calls. They spoke to loved ones, to spouses, to emergency operators, and they made a decision that would define them forever. They would fight back. The cockpit had already been taken by the hijackers, who had turned the plane toward Washington. Some believe their target was the White House. Others suspect the Capitol building. But just after 10 a.m., voices were heard on the cockpit recorder. A struggle, a prayer. At 10:03 a.m., United Flight 93 slammed into a quiet field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, at over 560 miles per hour, inverted and almost nose down. The impact was catastrophic. There were no survivors, but the attack had failed. Thanks to the bravery of its passengers, the last plane never reached its target. And in those moments, something quietly shifted. Across the country, televisions remained on. Phones stayed glued to hands. People stood in offices and living rooms, numb, staring. The day felt endless, surreal. Cities locked down, bridges closed. Military jets patrolled American airspace. There were rumors, there were false alarms, there were tears. In less than 2 hours, the most powerful nation on earth had been struck in the heart. By weapons, not of armies, but of its own civilian planes, turned against it by a handful of men. And yet, something else had happened, too. Amid the fire and the smoke, amid the dust and disbelief, a story of resistance had begun. A field in Pennsylvania now held the first glimmer of American defiance. By 10 a.m., both towers of the World Trade Center still stood, burning, but seemingly stable to the untrained eye. The North Tower had been hit first, yet it remained upright, burning for over an hour. The South Tower, struck second and lower, was far more unstable, and it was first to fall. At 9:59 a.m., after burning for 56 minutes, the South Tower gave way. It began with a strange sound, metal groaning under immense heat and pressure. The upper floor started to tilt ever so slightly, like a structure sagging under invisible weight. Then, in one horrifying moment, the entire crown of the building gave way, dropping like a hammer onto the floors below. Each floor pancaked upon the next, one after another, in less than 10 seconds. Steel columns snapped like twigs. Office furniture, stairwells, people, everything inside was pulverized. A massive cloud of dust exploded outward, engulfing lower Manhattan in an eerie gray fog. It was as if the building had disappeared into itself. Firefighters and first responders near the base had no time to react. Many were inside, climbing up in hopes of reaching trapped victims. Some had made it as far as the 30th floor. Some had just entered the lobby. Others were stationed nearby on the street. When the tower fell, the dust cloud hit like a hurricane, blinding, choking, disorienting. People ran blindly through the gray. Some stumbled into storefronts, covering their mouths with coats and sleeves. Others collapsed from exhaustion or were lost entirely in the swirl. Survivors later described the darkness as absolute, like being buried alive. Daylight vanished. Just 29 minutes later, at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower fell. It had stood longer, burned longer, held on longer, but no structure could endure the combination of jet fuel, intense fire, and structural failure forever. Like its sister tower, the North Tower buckled floor by floor, the collapse beginning at the impact zone and racing downward. The antenna atop the roof vanished into a swirl of steel and ash. Once again, Manhattan shook. Once again, the sky turned gray. And now, both towers were gone. What had once defined the New York skyline, twin beacons of modern architecture, was now a smoldering pile of debris over 100 feet high. The World Trade Center complex was unrecognizable. Adjacent buildings were damaged or destroyed. Fires raged uncontrolled. Cars burned in nearby parking lots. Ambulances and police cruisers were covered in soot. In the hours and days that followed, the area would be known simply as Ground Zero. The collapse wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The towers had symbolized ambition, trade, and American urban might. They had withstood bombings before in 1993. A car bomb in the parking garage had killed 6 and wounded over 1,000. But this was different. This was annihilation. And with the towers came the toll. Thousands were inside the buildings when the planes hit. Many more never made it out. Office workers, receptionists, janitors, and among them, hundreds of firefighters and police officers, many of whom had rushed in just before the collapses. In total, 343 firefighters from the FDNY, 70 police officers, including members of the Port Authority and NYPD, paramedics, chaplains, volunteers. Entire companies of first responders were wiped out. Radios went silent. In precincts and firehouses around the city, men and women waited for names to be called over the scanner. Many were never heard again. And yet, even as the towers fell, the rescue did not stop. In the surrounding chaos, first responders pulled people from under rubble. Civilians helped guide the injured through ash-covered streets. Medical triage stations were set up in parks and nearby buildings. Water was passed hand to hand. Shoes were given to those who had fled barefoot. Strangers became family. The sheer weight of what had happened hadn't fully registered. The skyline was broken. The island was bruised. But the spirit of service and sacrifice remained. Later, cameras would show images now burned into history. Firefighters raising an American flag atop the wreckage. Rescue dogs sniffing through rubble. Walls of missing person posters, thousands of faces, with hopeful notes and phone numbers. And all the while, the dust fell. Every surface in Lower Manhattan was coated in a fine layer of gray drywall. Cement, insulation, glass, ash. It lingered in the air, coated lungs, and stuck to clothes. For months afterward, it would become the silent marker of those who had been there. And beneath that dust lay twisted beams and crushed lives. Fires smoldered deep inside the ruins for weeks. And the search began not just for survivors, but for understanding. The skyline had changed. The country had changed, and the world would never be the same. In the minutes and hours after the towers fell, a strange kind of silence settled over Lower Manhattan. Not the peace of a quiet morning, or the hush of snowfall. This was a heavy, choking silence, the kind that presses against your ears and makes even the smallest sound feel deafening. Sirens still echoed, distant and sporadic. But much of the noise that defines New York City, honking horns, clattering trains, shouted conversations had simply stopped. People wandered through the gray haze in slow motion. Some were barefoot, having lost their shoes in the mad dash. Others were wrapped in coats, bandanas pulled over their faces, eyes wide and unblinking. A few stumbled forward aimlessly, covered head to toe in soot, looking like survivors of some ancient volcanic eruption. Phones didn't work. The cell towers had been damaged or overwhelmed. People tried in vain to call loved ones. Payphones, if they could be found, were clogged with lines of desperate callers, quarters clenched in their fists. Offices downtown were abandoned. Streets usually packed with delivery trucks and taxis were now a vast, open emptiness. Ferries left Manhattan packed with evacuees. Many of them still coughing, still shaking. Others crossed bridges on foot. Thousands of people walking across the Brooklyn Bridge in eerie silence. Some crying, some praying, some staring straight ahead, unable to speak. Dust coated everything, their clothes, their hair, their skin. No one really knew what had just happened. Rumors spread another plane was on the way. The White House had been hit. More cities were under attack. The scale of it was too big to grasp. In Washington, the Pentagon smoldered, and a gaping hole yawned in its side where Flight 77 had struck. Emergency workers pulled charred metal and broken bodies from the run. The sky above the Capitol, usually filled with air traffic, was empty. And then came the grounding. For the first time in U.S. history, the Federal Aviation Administration ordered all civilian aircraft to land. Every commercial flight in the sky was directed to the nearest airport. Over 4,000 planes touched down in a matter of hours. Some landed in cities they weren't scheduled for. Some diverted to Canada. Runways filled. Terminals overflowed. It was a coordinated shutdown of the nation's airspace. And then the skies fell silent. No jet engines. No contrails. No sound from above. Only stillness. Across the United States, televisions were turned on and left on. People sat in offices, homes, waiting rooms, airports, watching the same looping footage. The planes, striking the towers, the explosions, the collapses. Again and again. There was no escape from the images, and yet no one could look away. In hospitals, staff prepared for a flood of injured, but few came. Most who had been inside the towers were either already safe or gone. The morgues began to fill instead. Names began to trickle in, then more names. Missing persons lists appeared online. Walls in Manhattan became covered with flyers. Faces of the lost. Have you seen this person? Handwritten notes, phone numbers. Disparity. Please, the death toll climbed steadily. In the coming days, it would reach nearly 3,000. And even as the physical destruction was being tallied, the emotional wreckage stretched far wider. In towns across America, families waited for word. Children came home to find a parent missing. Husbands and wives checked voicemail for messages they hoped existed. Friends lit candles and held vigil. Churches opened their doors. So did mosques, synagogues, and temples. And amid the grief, something else began to take shape. Unity. It was quiet at first. A neighbor bringing food, a stranger offering a ride, blood donation lines that stretched for blocks, first responders from other states driving to New York and Washington, asking how they could help. Flags appeared on porches, in windows, on street corners, not as decoration but as symbols of grief, of solidarity, of something bruised, but still standing. Fire stations across New York became memorials, helmets lined up along fences, bouquets tucked into the grates, children's drawings taped to the windows, crayon hearts and shaky words, like thank you and we love you. Tourists and locals alike stood in silence, heads bowed. And through it all, the city did not sleep. Volunteers worked round the clock at Ground Zero. Crews hauled away debris by the ton. Fires still smoldered deep in the rubble. The air was acrid, thick with particles no one yet fully understood. The sound of heavy machinery, of cranes and excavators and trucks, replaced the usual hum of taxis and foot traffic. Some workers dug with their hands. Others formed bucket brigades. Hopes for survivors faded. But still, they searched. Even at night, the lights stayed on. Floodlights cast eerie shadows across the ruins, giving the wreckage a surreal, haunted glow. And above it all, the sky remained empty. For a few quiet, terrible days in September, it felt as though time had stopped, that the world had been cleaved into a before and an after, and no one yet knew what that after would look like. In the chaos of the morning, as the towers burned and the Pentagon smoked, the President of the United States was not in Washington. George W. Bush was in Sarasota, Florida, visiting Emma E. Booker Elementary School. He was sitting in a classroom, listening quietly as children read aloud from a storybook titled The Pet Goat. Outside the classroom, chaos had already begun. At 8:46 a.m., when American Airlines Flight 11 hit the North Tower, Bush had just finished breakfast. He was briefed immediately by his chief of staff. At first there was confusion. A plane had struck the tower, perhaps a small private aircraft, maybe an accident. Then came the second strike. United Flight 175 slammed into the South Tower at 9:03 a.m. In that moment, all illusions of accident vanished. America was under attack. Inside the classroom, a Secret Service agent approached the president, leaned in, and whispered an infamous sentence into his ear. A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack. For a full 7 minutes, Bush remained seated. He nodded, his expression fixed, his body still. Around him, the children kept reading, unaware of the world unraveling outside their school. Critics would later debate his stillness, whether it was paralysis or composure. But in that moment, the president was absorbing the weight of what had just begun. By 9:30 a.m., he was speaking to the nation. His voice was steady but grim. Terrorism against our nation, he said, will not stand. And then he was airborne. Air Force One left Florida under tight security, climbing into a sky now emptied of other aircraft. The Secret Service insisted he avoid Washington. No one knew how many planes remained unaccounted for. The threat wasn't over. So the president became a moving target, first flying to Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana, then to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska. Even the highest seat of power had to keep moving. It was surreal. The leader of the free world, reduced to a ghost on the radar, navigating a landscape suddenly without rules. Back in Washington, Vice President Dick Cheney had been rushed into an underground bunker beneath the White House. The Presidential Emergency Operations Center, dark, secure, and built for continuity in the event of nuclear war, now served as the heart of American leadership. There, Cheney coordinated with military officials. Orders were given to shoot down any additional hijacked planes. At one point, a commercial aircraft veered off course and stopped responding. Fighter jets were scrambled. Tensions rose. Later, it was discovered the plane had simply lost contact. The world had become a place where such errors might trigger fatal consequences. Meanwhile, congressional leaders were evacuated from the Capitol. Members of Congress, some still in suits, were hurried out through tunnels into undisclosed locations. Government buildings emptied. Sirens wailed across the National Mall. It felt less like a city and more like a battleground. But even amidst the confusion, the machinery of government kept turning. Decisions had to be made quickly, quietly. One of those decisions was to ground all international flights. Planes already over the Atlantic were redirected to Canada, which welcomed them with a grace and generosity few would forget. In towns like Gander, Newfoundland, thousands of unexpected passengers were taken in, fed. It was one of many small kindnesses that bloomed in the shadow of tragedy. As the day wore on, America tried to comprehend what had happened. But comprehension was slippery. The images were real, but their meaning was vast and unknowable. In those hours, the need for leadership visible, calming, and decisive was paramount. By the evening of September 11th, Air Force One finally returned to Washington. The president entered the White House just after nightfall. At 8:30 p.m., George W. Bush addressed the nation from the Oval Office. His speech was simple, direct. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, he said. But he promised justice, promised resolve. He told Americans to pray for the victims, to support rescue workers, and to trust that the government was working to protect them. Outside, the White House was surrounded by barricades. Military vehicles rumbled through the streets. The Capitol was guarded. Fighter jets circled overhead. The very air seemed watchful. But inside millions of homes, people lit candles, gathered with family, held hands in silence. Dogs barked. Children asked questions their parents couldn't answer. No one really slept. And still, the fires burned at Ground Zero still. The air was thick with ash and fear and loss. In that dark, uncertain night, America began to shift. The world before September 11th was gone, and no one, not even the president, knew what would come next. Across the Atlantic, it was already mid-afternoon when the first plane struck. In London, commuters had returned to their desks. In Paris, cafes buzzed with conversation. In Berlin, office windows framed soft autumn light. And then the footage began. News channels broke from regular programming. At first, it seemed like a freak accident, smoke billowing from one tower. But moments later, a second plane appeared on live television, slicing through the blue sky like a knife through silk. It struck the South Tower with impossible force. A flash of fire, then smoke. Across Europe, televisions flickered into living rooms, shops, pubs, train stations. In Japan, Australia, Brazil, South Africa, people watched, transfixed and horrified. At airports, passengers crowded around terminals, eyes wide, mouths covered by trembling hands. Children glimpsed images they couldn't comprehend. Adults struggled to explain what had happened, what was happening. The world seemed to halt mid. Then, the collapse. First, the South Tower, then the North. The sight was dreamlike in its impossibility. Towers that had stood for decades, erased in seconds. A perfect vertical fall into a grey-brown storm of smoke and steel. What had once been thousands of stories of people, meetings, laughter, phone calls, lives reduced to a trembling void. And though it had happened in America, the grief spilled far beyond its borders. In London, the Queen ordered a guard change at Buckingham Palace. The band of the Coldstream Guards played the Star-Spangled Banner, a gesture so rare, so symbolic, that onlookers wept quietly in the morning sun. British newspapers ran black borders. Candlelight vigils spread through Trafalgar Square. Buskers stopped singing. The city became hushed. In Canada, flags were lowered to half. Citizens opened their homes to stranded passengers from diverted flights. In towns like Gander, Newfoundland, residents turned schools into shelters, cooked meals for total strangers, and offered rides, clothes, and kindness. In France, firefighters stood in solidarity. In Germany, church bells rang out for the dead. In Moscow, people laid flowers at the American embassy. Even in countries that often stood at odds with U.S. policy, citizens shared in mourning. The emotion was not only sadness, it was recognition, the sense that something deeply human had been wounded. It was not just America's loss, it was everyone's. a symbolic unraveling of modern certainty. The idea that tall buildings would always stand, that morning flights were routine, that peace was permanent. Now the world knew otherwise. World leaders called to express condolences. Governments pledged support. For the first time in NATO's history, Article 5 was invoked, a declaration that an attack on one member was an attack on all. Even long-standing adversaries of the United States offered words of sympathy and shock. Television coverage continued. Images looped endlessly: planes hitting, towers falling, people running from walls of smoke. The images burned themselves into collective memory, not just for Americans, but for billions around the world. In classrooms, teachers struggled to answer questions. In hospitals, doctors watched in silence between shifts. In temples, mosques, and churches, candles flickered beside framed photographs and handwritten prayers. But even in global solidarity, something else stirred. Fear. Airports braced for copycat attacks. Military bases elevated threat levels. Intelligence agencies launched frantic reviews of possible future plots. Around the world, countries began asking uncomfortable questions. Were we next? Were we ready? For travelers stranded overseas, time felt distorted. Flights were grounded. Hotels filled. Communications slowed. But amid the frustration, there were also moments of grace. Locals offering soup, phone calls, companionship. In crisis, kindness shone through. In newspapers and headlines, a new vocabulary began to appear: terrorism, jihad, homeland security, axis of evil. These terms would shape the next decade. But in the quiet hours of September 11th itself, they were not yet hardened. The world was still absorbing, still mourning. There was a collective inhale, long, slow, and uncertain. Even in countries where America's role had long been resented, citizens could distinguish between politics and people. What they saw was not just an attack on a nation, but on humanity. And then, slowly, the world began to light candles. In windowsills, on porches, in town squares and cathedrals and alleyways, a silent flickering resistance to the darkness. The United States was not alone in its pain. That day, grief became global, and so did resolve. The world had changed, not just for America but for everyone, and no one quite knew what the morning would bring. After the towers fell, there was nothing. No roar, no engine, no sound except the soft hiss of settling dust and the low moan of twisted metal. For blocks in every direction, Lower Manhattan looked like the surface of the moon gray. Cracked, featureless, ash drifted down like snow. Office papers, receipts, memos, handwritten notes floated through the air, surreal as feathers. People walked like ghosts, covered in soot, their faces frozen in disbelief. Eyes blinked behind dust-coated glasses. Some wandered aimlessly, barefoot. Coats turned into makeshift masks. No one knew where to go. No one knew if it was over. The ground itself seemed wounded. The streets were cracked and steaming, the sidewalks scorched. Fire hydrants hissed. Crushed cars were pancaked under beams the size of ships. Steel jutted skyward at broken angles, like ribs from a collapsed skeleton. And, in the middle of it all, silence. The usual thrum of Manhattan sirens, honks conversations. Crosswalks was gone. Cell towers were destroyed. Power disrupted. The city that never slept now barely breathed. But within that stillness came movement. First, the firemen. They came from every borough of duty, retired, volunteered. Some ran toward the smoke even before the second tower fell. Some had already lost brothers, chiefs, friends in the collapse. They didn't stop. They climbed over wreckage, dug with gloved hands, called out into voids of ash and iron. Then the police, the transit workers, iron workers, paramedics, construction crews, nurses, ordinary citizens. Everyone became a rescuer. Together, they formed bucket brigades, passing ash and rubble, hand by hand. They crawled under twisted rebar, used jackhammers to split fallen walls, listened for faint taps from deep below. Search dogs barked at pockets of heat. Hope flickered with every noise. They found a few. A woman trapped between a fallen floor and a stairwell, still alive after 26 hours. A firefighter pulled from beneath an engine. A secretary bruised and burned, her voice hoarse from screaming. Each life saved was a miracle carved from hell. But with every hour, the odds grew dimmer. Hospitals had prepared for mass casualties. They didn't arrive. Doctors waited in MTRs, IVs ready, stretchers lined up. But there were no patients, only the dead. And yet the work continued. Volunteers set up makeshift triage tents. Food arrived from everywhere: sandwiches, coffee, bottled water stacked in towers beside the ruins. Church groups cooked chili. Restaurants donated supplies. Strangers showed up with boots, gloves, gas masks. Ground Zero, though the name had not yet been coined, became both battlefield and temple. A place of smoke and sweat and prayer. Everywhere, there were small rituals. Firefighters taped pictures of missing colleagues to truck windows. Police officers saluted every time a stretcher passed, whether full or empty. Someone hung an American flag over a broken street lamp. A priest blessed bodies, one by one, pulled from the wreckage. Even the dogs were given water, affection, and rest. The dust never settled. It clung to every surface, metallic, sharp, acrid. It was in lungs, on lips, inside shoes, and hair, and skin. It smelled of scorched plastic, jet fuel, concrete, and something far worse. It coated everything with the weight of what had happened. Still, they worked, around the clock, in shifts, in silence. No one shouted. No one panicked. It was a strange sort of reverence, grief channeled into motion. They weren't just clearing rubble. They were honoring the fallen, giving shape to mourning. New Yorkers lined up around blood banks, even when the need had passed. People stood on sidewalks for hours just to hand water bottles to first responders. Children drew thank you signs. Taxi drivers gave free rides. The city, wounded but not broken, leaned into the pain and kept going. The search became recovery. Names were spoken. Faces posted on walls. Entire buildings became bulletin boards of missing persons. Some flyers had descriptions. Others just a smile, a phone number, a hope. By the end of the week, it became clear. There were fewer to find than hoped. The towers had not fallen like buildings, they had disintegrated, and the scale of the loss was incomprehensible. But still, they came. Day after day, men and women in hard hats descended into smoke and steel, and each one of them carried something invisible: grief, yes, but also something more ancient: duty, compassion, solidarity. It didn't erase the pain, but, in the dark, it was a kind of light. And beneath the rubble, in that terrible silence, it was the sound of humanity enduring. The days after September 11th did not feel like ordinary days. Time itself seemed to change. Minutes stretched longer. Days bled together. Sunrises arrived quietly, but the skies no longer felt safe. Commercial airplanes, once symbols of convenience and freedom, were now terrifying silhouettes in the sky. For a time, they stopped flying altogether. The silence above cities was deafening. Across the United States, people stayed glued to televisions. News anchors whispered updates over endless footage. The towers falling again and again, from every possible angle. Smoke rising from the Pentagon. The blackened crater in Pennsylvania. It was surreal, like watching a loop from another world, one that had somehow become real. There were no answers yet, only questions. Who had done this? Why would there be another attack? Were we at war? Was it safe to go outside, to fly, to gather in public? Fear settled deep into the bones of the country. Skyscrapers emptied early. Airports remained shuttered. Tourist sites closed. People whispered in subways, jumped at sudden noises, and eyed strangers with suspicion. Uncertainty became the atmosphere everyone breathed. But alongside the fear, there was sorrow. A sorrow that was quiet, heavy, and shared. It wasn't just those who had lost loved ones. Though their pain was immeasurable, it was everyone, even people with no connection to New York, Washington, or the victims. The nation felt wounded, collectively, as though a part of its innocence had been peeled away. Flags appeared everywhere, draped across balconies, taped in windows, tied to car antennas. Children drew them in chalk on sidewalks. Towns held candlelight vigils. Churches, synagogues, and mosques opened their doors for prayer. People cried in the grocery store, hugged strangers on street corners, said "I love you" more than usual. In workplaces and schools, there was an awkward stillness. How do you carry on with meetings, homework, and errands when thousands have died? When the future feels fragile? When the sky itself has turned into a weapon? There was no manual, no blueprint, only instinct. To come together, people donated blood. So much blood that many banks overflowed with supplies they couldn't use. Others gave money, food, blankets, clothes. Entire communities mobilized. High school students held fundraisers. Grandmothers knitted scarves. Musicians sang softly on corners. It was as if everyone was trying, in their own small way, to fill the void. In airports, new security measures began appearing overnight: metal detectors, bag checks, uniformed guards with rifles. It was strange and jarring, but few protested. The shock was still too fresh. Anything that might prevent another attack seemed not just reasonable, but necessary. On television, late night, comedians paused their shows. Sitcoms aired reruns. Even commercials changed. Nobody wanted laughter, not yet. Not while the fire still smoldered. Not while funerals had barely begun. In Washington, politicians stood together, Republicans and Democrats side by side, vowing unity. The American flag was unfurled over the Capitol steps, and for a moment, partisanship disappeared. For a moment, the only identity that mattered was American. But the pain was not confined to the United States. Around the world, cities held their own in London, Berlin, Tokyo, Sydney, strangers lit candles, wept in solidarity, placed flowers outside American embassies. A French newspaper printed the headline, "We are all American." Children in Kenya prayed. Firefighters in Canada wore black armbands. The Queen of England broke protocol and had the US national anthem played at the changing of the guard. The world mourned together. Yet even in this unity, seeds of division were quietly being planted. In some places, fear gave way to suspicion. Muslim Americans, Sikh Americans, anyone who looked foreign, found themselves stared at, insulted. Mosques were vandalized, hijabs were pulled off, cab drivers were harassed. Some people's patriotism was questioned simply because of their name or skin color. For every act of kindness, there were also moments of cruelty, often born from ignorance, confusion, or rage. The grief of a nation was not simple. It was tangled with sorrow, love, fear, fury, and a deep need for someone to blame. Still, for many, the defining emotion remained heartbreak. Families searched desperately for the missing, clinging to hope long after reason said otherwise. Phone lines jammed with calls that would never be answered. Voicemails saved and replayed, again and again, just to hear a familiar voice say, "I love you," one last time. And in the quiet moments, in kitchens and bedrooms, on sidewalks and stairwells, people wept for the lives lost, for the world changed, for the feeling that something sacred had been broken and could never be put back exactly the same. But even through the sorrow, there was something else, a resilience. Fragile, but real. People got up, went to work, helped their neighbors, held their children closer, lit candles in windows, prayed for peace. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't defiance. It was simply the human spirit doing what it always has, continuing quietly, even when everything has changed. In the weeks after the towers fell, a new phrase entered the American vocabulary: the war on terror. It wasn't declared with tanks rolling across borders, or fleets setting sail across oceans. It began with words, a quiet speech, solemn and controlled, delivered by President George W. Bush from the Oval Office. He looked tired. Determined, "Our war on terror begins," he said. But it does not end. It was a different kind of war, not against a country, but against an idea, against networks, against those who plotted quietly, in shadows, across continents. There were no uniforms, no capital cities to seize, no official declarations of surrender. It would be long, ambiguous, global. The first target was clear: Afghanistan. It was there, in the mountains and caves, that Osama bin Laden, the man behind the attacks, was believed to be hiding. He was not new to the CIA. They had tracked him for years. But after 9/11, he became the most wanted man on earth. The ruling regime in Afghanistan, the Taliban, had provided bin Laden with safe haven when they refused to hand him over. The United States, with support from NATO and other allies, launched Operation Enduring Freedom on October 7th. Precision bombings lit up the night skies over Kabul and Kandahar. Special forces moved in. Within weeks, the Taliban government collapsed. Cities once controlled by extremists were now in US and Allied hands. Footage showed Afghan women removing their men trimming their beards, music playing again in the streets. There was hope. But victory was not simple. The enemy had no front lines. Taliban fighters melted into mountains and villages. Al-Qaeda cells slipped away, into Pakistan, into hiding. And bin Laden, still nowhere to be found. What had started as retaliation evolved into occupation. A long, costly effort to rebuild a broken country, to train an army, to establish democracy in a land scarred by decades of war. American soldiers began rotating through dusty outposts. Months turned into years. A generation of young men and women would go to Afghanistan. Many wouldn't return. Back in the US, the early months of the war were met with unity and support. Flags waved high. Polls showed near universal backing. Few questioned a mission. The memory of 9/11s was still raw. Justice felt urgent. But behind the scenes, a larger plan was already taking shape. One that would soon lead America into a second, more controversial war. Iraq. The Bush administration, particularly Vice President Dick Cheney and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, began warning that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction, WMDs. They claimed he had chemical and biological weapons, that he was pursuing nuclear arms, that he might give them to terrorists. The argument was not that Saddam had attacked on 9/11s. He had but that, in this new world, after 9/11s, America couldn't afford to wait for threats to become real. Preemption became doctrine. The idea was chilling. Strike first, before being struck. In March 2003, the US invaded Iraq. Once again, the early stages seemed successful. Baghdad fell quickly. Saddam Hussein fled, only to be captured months later, hiding in a hole in the ground. The world watched, stunned, as he was eventually tried and executed by the new Iraqi government. But no WMDs were found. The intelligence had been wrong, or perhaps selectively interpreted. Trust began to erode. Iraq descended into sectarian violence. Militias battled US troops and each other. Car bombs exploded in crowded markets. A once strong support for the war back home began to fray. Families of soldiers began asking, why? What are we doing there? How long will this go on? And through it all, Osama bin Laden remained free. The war on terror, once narrowly focused, had become sprawling, touching Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Pakistan, Somalia. Drones flew silently over distant lands. Secret prisons were established. The line between justice and vengeance, between defense and aggression, blurred. America was now engaged in the longest war in its history, but the impact wasn't just military. It was psychological, cultural. The war changed how Americans saw the world, and how the world saw America. Terror alerts became part of daily life. Color-coded warnings blinked on news screens. Red for severe, orange for high, yellow for elevated. People scanned subway platforms and airport terminals, eyes darting nervously. If you see something, say something. That was the new slogan. The war also reshaped technology and surveillance. Government agencies were given sweeping new powers to monitor phone calls, emails, travel records. Airports introduced pat-downs, scanners, long lines. The Department of Homeland Security was created, a massive new bureaucracy built to defend the homeland from an enemy that could be anywhere. And perhaps most quietly, the country's sense of self began to change. There was still patriotism, yes, but also fatigue, division. Some Americans felt safer, others felt watched. Some trusted the government more, others trusted it less. The unity of those first days after 9/11 began to crack under the weight of a war that felt endless, and a fear that never quite disappeared. After the smoke had cleared and the flags were lowered to after the rubble had been sifted and the faces of the missing were taken down from chain-link fences, America entered a new kind of era, not marked by battlefields or invasions, but by something far more invisible. A quiet, enduring sense of fear. It wasn't constant panic. It didn't erupt into the streets, but it hummed softly beneath the surface of daily life, an awareness that something terrible had happened, and could happen again, at any time, in any place. The sky had once felt open, infinite, safe. Now, a low-flying plane might cause a wave of unease. A backpack left unattended in a subway station could trigger crowds, once comforting, now felt vulnerable. A new, invisible calculation entered everyday choices. Whether to fly, whether to attend a public event, whether to trust a stranger. And with that shift came language. Subtle phrases embedded themselves into American life. National security, sleeper cells, homegrown, radical, axes of evil, enhanced interrogation. These were not just political talking points. They became the vocabulary of a changed culture. Children growing up in the years after 9/11s were shaped by this language, often without realizing it. They lined up for school under tighter security. Field trips required more permissions. Lockdown drills became common. Metal detectors at school entrances no longer felt shocking. This was simply life. The media reflected and amplified these shifts. Television was saturated with 9/11's retrospectives, docudramas, and breaking news alerts. Movies took on darker tones. Heroes were flawed. Threats came from within. Popular shows like 24 and Homeland reflected a world where enemies could be neighbors and hard choices were always justified. Even cartoons and commercials began echoing themes of vigilance, resilience, and loyalty. And then, slowly, a new stereotype began to crystallize, one that casts suspicion on Muslims and Middle Eastern Americans, regardless of their citizenship, beliefs, or behavior. Mosques across the US faced vandalism, protests, and scrutiny. Muslim Americans, including lifelong citizens, were pulled aside for extra screening at airports. Children were bullied in schools for speaking Arabic or wearing headscarves. Entire communities lived under a cloud of suspicion. This was not just interpersonal prejudice. It was institutional. After 9/11, the FBI increased surveillance of Muslim neighborhoods, mosques, and community centers. Immigration policies were tightened, and entire countries were flagged as high. People who had lived peacefully in the US for decades now feared deportation, detainment, or simply being watched. For some Americans, this shift in attitude felt like patriotism, a desire to defend the homeland at all costs. For others, it felt like a betrayal of American values, of freedom, inclusion, and justice. The tension was subtle, but omnipresent. Neighbors grew wary. Conversations became guarded. Flags hung proudly on porches, but sometimes they masked division instead of unity. And then came the commemoration, a cycle that would repeat year after year. Each September 11th, the country paused. Bells tolled. Names were read aloud. Families returned to ground zero, carrying photographs of loved ones. Candles flickered. Documentaries aired once again. Voices cracked with memory. The same images, the towers falling, the firemen, the flags resurfaced, not to shock, but to honor. But for many, these annual rituals were also emotional landmines. The trauma of that day was still raw, buried beneath layers of routine and time, but never far from reach. Survivors and first responders suffered quietly from PTSD. Many experienced survivor's guilt. Others lived with chronic illnesses from inhaling toxic dust at ground zero. Some were still trying to identify remains. Even decades later, small fragments of bone and ash continued to be unknown. And across the country, people asked, how do you move on from something like this? Should we forget? Should we forgive? America tried to thread that needle, to remember without being consumed, to honor the lost without losing itself in fear. But it was difficult, because the impact of 9/11 wasn't just emotional, it was practical. It reshaped the built environment, too. Skyscrapers were redesigned with blast-proof glass and reinforced stairwells. Stadiums installed checkpoints and bag searches. Public buildings became more fortress-like. Concrete barriers, bollards, and metal fences appeared outside libraries, courthouses, and office towers. Even air travel, once seen as glamorous or mundane, was transformed. Passengers removed shoes. Liquids were measured in ounces. Privacy was sacrificed for safety. The TSA, once non-existent, became a ubiquitous part of the flying experience. Airports no longer felt like gateways to adventure. They felt like checkpoints on the front lines of a long, quiet war. And yet, amid all these changes, there was also resilience. Communities came together in new ways. People volunteered. Blood drives overflowed. Fire departments were flooded with new recruits. Teachers, counselors, and clergy worked tirelessly to guide young people through a world that felt less certain. Art, too, responded. With music, poetry, sculpture. The 9/11 Memorial in New York became a place of reflection and calm. Two endless pools of water, sinking into the footprint of where the towers once stood, offered a different kind of silence. One filled not with fear, but remembrance. It was this duality, fear and hope, vigilance and compassion, that defined post-9/11's America. A country that had been shaken to its core was slowly reshaping itself. Not perfectly, not without mistakes, but with a deep, sometimes painful awareness that it had crossed a threshold from a world before to a world after. And even though life returned to a kind of normal, something essential had shifted. America would never quite be the same. In the quiet aftermath of September 11th, the political landscape of not just America, but the entire world began to change. For decades, the Cold War had shaped alliances and enmities. Now, a new enemy emerged, one without a clear country or flag. Terrorism was everywhere and nowhere. It challenged traditional diplomacy and defense. In the first days, NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time ever. The principle that an attack on one ally is an attack on all. This created a new sense of unity among Western powers. Countries like Britain, Canada, Australia, and Germany pledged support for the United States. Soldiers deployed to Afghanistan in joint effort. Intelligence was shared with unprecedented cooperation. But beyond the alliance, tensions grew. The Middle East, already a complex and volatile region, became the center of new conflicts. The US focused on Afghanistan and later Iraq intensified long-standing grievances. Some governments viewed the American presence as occupation rather than liberation. Anti-American sentiment surged in many parts of the world, leading to protests, violence, and fractured diplomacy. Within the United States, politics shifted sharply. Security became a top priority. The Department of Homeland Security was created, merging numerous agencies to coordinate national defense against terrorism. The Patriot Act was passed, expanding government surveillance powers. These moves sparked debates about privacy, civil liberties, and the balance between freedom and security. At home and abroad, some questioned whether the new policies were effective or overreaching. Meanwhile, the war on terror altered the US's relationships with allies and adversaries alike. Countries with strong intelligence sharing ties deepened cooperation, while others, wary of American unilateralism, grew distant. The US increasingly acted alone or with a small coalition, especially in Iraq, where many traditional allies did not support the invasion. This strained old friendships and challenged the global order established after World War II. The attacks also highlighted the rise of new powers and the shifting focus of geopolitics. China continued its economic ascent. Russia sought to reassert influence in former Soviet states. The Middle East became a hotspot for proxy conflicts, sectarian wars, and ideological battles. Non-state actors, like terrorist groups, showed how power could be wielded without territory. For ordinary people, these shifts often felt abstract, but they shaped the world they lived in. Through news reports, immigration policies, and the presence of American troops overseas, the quiet, invisible world of diplomacy became a new battlefield. At the same time, many Americans felt a renewed sense of purpose and patriotism. Community centers held flag-raising ceremonies. Schools taught lessons on unity and resilience. Veterans were honored more openly. Yet, the wounds from 9/11s also fed into rising political divisions. Debates over the war, civil rights, immigration, and national security fueled partisanship. Trust in government institutions ebbed and flowed. Conspiracy theories and misinformation found fertile ground in a nation still grappling with trauma. As the years passed, the events of 9/11s remained a touchstone, a moment when the world visibly changed, when the lines between friend and foe blurred, and when the global balance shifted in subtle but profound ways. The world had been and the ripples would be felt for generations. In the months and years that followed September 11th, the pulse of American cities shifted quietly but unmistakably. Once, city streets bustled freely, sidewalks filled with hurried footsteps, office workers chatting over coffee, tourists snapping photos of skylines that seemed eternal. But after 9/11s, the rhythm changed, slowed by a new awareness that danger could strike anywhere. In New York City, the most visible transformation was Ground Zero itself. The void where the Twin Towers once stood was a daily reminder of loss, resilience, and hope. Around the site, streets were rerouted, barricades appeared, and the hum of construction filled the air as workers labored to rebuild. The World Trade Center's rebirth was slow, deliberate, a symbol that life would return, but not quite the same. Across other cities, subtle changes multiplied. Buildings once open and welcoming became fortified. Metal detectors were installed at corporate lobbies and public buildings. Security guards now screened visitors, checked bags, and watched for anything unusual. Windows were reinforced. Parking lots were guarded by concrete barriers and bollards, designed to stop vehicles from crashing into buildings. Public transportation, the veins of urban life, became both a source of anxiety and a symbol of subway riders grew used to bag checks and random police patrols. Suspicious packages could trigger train stations installed closed-circuit cameras, and riders were encouraged to report anything out of place. For many, the daily commute was a reminder that safety was no longer guaranteed, yet life must go on. Airports, too, changed forever. Gone were the carefree days of strolling to the gate with just a ticket in hand. Shoes came off, belts unbuckled, liquids measured in small bottles. Passengers lined up patiently for hours. The Transportation Security Administration, born from 9/11's aftermath, became a fixture both reassuring and sometimes frustrating. But these changes didn't stop daily life, they shaped it. Festivals, concerts, and public gatherings continued, but with added precautions. Event organizers planned emergency exits and security sweeps. Families still met in parks. Children played on swings. The heart of American life beat on. Communities adapted, growing stronger in some ways. Neighborhood watch groups expanded their scope, not just watching for petty crime, but also scanning for anything unusual. Local police departments worked more closely with federal agencies. Schools held emergency drills, teaching children how to respond calmly to threats. And yet, even with heightened awareness, many Americans refused to live in fear. Instead, they chose resilience. Public art projects appeared, honoring heroes and victims. Murals blossomed on brick walls. Volunteer groups organized cleanups and memorial services. Neighbors checked on one another more often. At the same time, cultural expressions captured this new reality. Songs echoed loss and hope. Poets and writers grappled with trauma and healing. Films and television shows reflected the tension between security and freedom, often exploring moral complexities with nuance. New York's famous skyline itself slowly began to rise again. One World Trade Center, standing taller than before, symbolized the city's defiance and determination. Yet, the building's design incorporated lessons learned at fortified stairwells, blast-resistant glass, and new evacuation protocols. Everywhere, a balance was sought between remembering and moving forward. The physical changes in cities were more than architecture or policy, they represented a society coming to terms with vulnerability. The streets, the subways, the airports all became spaces where history lingered, quietly urging vigilance and compassion. And through it all, the American spirit endured, quietly glowing in the midst of change. Amid the overwhelming destruction and grief of September 11th, countless stories of courage and resilience quietly unfolded. For those trapped inside the Twin Towers, stairwells became lifelines, and choices were matters of life or death. Some people held hands with strangers, offering whispered reassurances amid smoke and dust. Others used broken phones to call loved ones, speaking words they hoped would be remembered. Survivors recall the surreal moments when the air turned thick and the world narrowed to just the steps ahead. They describe the struggle to keep moving, even as fear gnawed at their minds. Some found small acts of kindness, a stranger sharing a sip of water, a firefighter's steady grip, a stranger's quiet encouragement. Outside, the first responders faced unimaginable challenges. Firefighters, police officers, paramedics, and volunteers rushed toward the chaos. They knew the dangers: falling debris, thick smoke, unstable structures, but turned away from safety to help others. Their training kicked in, but so did something deeper, a profound sense of duty. Hundreds of first responders lost their lives that day, many while guiding others to safety. Others would later suffer from illnesses caused by inhaling toxic dust and debris. The bond among them was unbreakable. They became a family forged in fire and loss. In the weeks and months after, they supported each other through grief and trauma. Memorials and ceremonies honored those who did not return, and the city of New York held them close, grateful for their bravery. Some survivors and responders found healing through telling their stories quietly. At first, sharing memories in counseling groups, writing memoirs, speaking at schools. Their voices gave shape to the trauma and reminded the world of the human lives behind the headlines. Yet, many also faced lasting struggles. Post-traumatic stress disorder affected thousands. Nightmares, anxiety, and depression were common but often hidden behind stoic facades. Medical conditions linked to 9/11's dust exposed thousands to new challenges, and the weight of survivors' guilt lingered long after the last piece of rubble was cleared. Despite all this, their stories are also ones of hope. Acts of kindness, during and after the attacks, highlighted the best of humanity. Strangers became heroes. Communities banded together. Volunteers flooded into New York from across the country, bringing food, water, and supplies. Donations poured in, Messages of solidarity crossed oceans. These narratives, gently told, remind us that even in the darkest moments, light can be found. They invite us to remember not just the tragedy, but the resilience, compassion, and enduring spirit that emerged from the ashes. The horror and heartbreak of September 11th echoed far beyond news reports and political speeches. It seeped into the very fabric of American culture, inspiring artists, filmmakers, writers, and musicians to process the tragedy, memorialize the lost, and explore what it meant to be human in a changed world. In the years after 9/11, art became a quiet sanctuary or place to hold grief and hope simultaneously. Visual artists painted canvases splattered with ash-like grays and fiery reds, capturing the chaos and calm after the storm. Some created haunting sculptures of twisted steel beams recovered from ground zero, transforming remnants of destruction into symbols of One of the most powerful artistic responses was the design of the 9/11 memorial in New York City, where the Twin Towers once rose. Two vast reflecting pools now rest in sunken footprints surrounded by trees. Water cascades gently down their edges, filling a deep silence. Around the pools, bronze panels bear the names of nearly 3,000 victims, an unbroken circle of remembrance. The memorial invites visitors to pause, to listen to the quiet sound of water and wind, and to reflect on loss and resilience. Film and television also grappled with 9/11's complex legacy. Documentaries captured first-hand accounts, carefully preserving history. Movies such as United 93 and World Trade Center told stories of heroism and survival without sensationalism. Television dramas began weaving terrorism and its aftermath into their narratives, exploring themes of identity, loyalty, and the moral dilemmas faced by those in uniform and civilians alike. Books ranging from memoirs to novels reflected on trauma, healing, and hope. Some focused on personal stories of loss, while others examined the broader societal changes. Poetry readings became spaces of shared remembrance. Libraries and schools incorporated 9/11's stories into curriculums, ensuring new generations understood the day's significance. Music provided another channel for collective mourning and strength. Songs honoring first responders, survivors, and the fallen played on radio stations and at memorials. Benefit concerts raised funds for relief efforts and inspired unity. The haunting strains of strings and voices became a gentle balm for grieving hearts. Even public spaces across the country felt the influence. Flags flew at high. Community memorials were built in towns far from New York. Annual ceremonies brought together families, officials, and citizens in quiet solidarity. The ritual of remembrance became a part of American life, both a comfort and a call to never forget. Through these creative expressions, Americans found ways to tell their stories, honor those lost, and imagine a future shaped by resilience rather than fear. Art, in its many forms, became a language of healing. It allowed people to process what words alone could not capture: the weight of loss, the light of hope, and the enduring spirit of a nation forever changed. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, the United States faced a profound dilemma: how to protect its citizens from future threats while preserving the freedoms that define its democracy. Almost immediately, sweeping changes reshaped the nation's approach to security. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security in 2002 brought together more than 20 federal agencies under one umbrella, centralizing efforts to prevent, respond to, and recover from terrorist attacks. This new department became the guardian of the homeland, tasked with identifying threats both foreign and domestic. The USA Patriot Act, passed swiftly after the attacks, expanded government powers for surveillance and investigation. It allowed law enforcement agencies to monitor phone calls, emails, financial transactions, and internet activity more extensively than ever before. These tools were seen as vital to intercept plots before they could unfold. Air travel underwent a transformation. The Transportation Security Administration introduced stringent screening procedures at airports nationwide. Shoes were removed, liquids restricted, carry-ons searched, lines grew longer, frustrations mounted. But for many, the inconvenience was a small price for safety. Yet, as these policies unfolded, they sparked debate. Critics worried that surveillance programs intruded too deeply into private lives, eroding constitutional rights. The secrecy surrounding some intelligence activities fueled suspicion. Questions arose. How much oversight existed? Could these powers be abused? Were innocent people being targeted? Muslim and Middle Eastern communities often found themselves disproportionately affected, Increased scrutiny, dissensions, and racial profiling fostered fear and alienation. Civil liberties groups challenged policies they viewed as discriminatory or unconstitutional. Courts became battlegrounds over what. This tension between security and liberty became a defining feature of post-9/11's America. Politicians, law enforcement, and citizens grappled with how to maintain vigilance without sacrificing the very freedoms that terrorists sought to undermine. It was a delicate balance, sometimes tipped by fear, other times by principle. The public's response was mixed. Some embraced the increased security measures, valuing safety over privacy. Others felt uneasy, watching the expansion of government powers with concern. Communities organized dialogues and advocacy groups, striving to educate and protect civil rights. The debate extended beyond America's borders. Allies and critics worldwide examined the United States' approach, influencing international relations and human rights discussions. Revelations about secret prisons, extraordinary renditions, and enhanced interrogation techniques stirred controversy. Yet, amid these complexities, the commitment to preventing another attack remained firm. Security experts and policymakers worked to improve intelligence sharing, cybersecurity, and emergency preparedness. Local, state, and federal agencies coordinated more closely. Technology evolved rapidly, providing new tools and new challenges. For ordinary Americans, these changes became part of daily life. Metal detectors at schools and stadiums, surveillance cameras watching public spaces, the pervasive sense that safety required vigilance and sometimes sacrifice. And through it all, the question lingered quietly. How can a free society remain secure without losing what makes it free? This question, born in the shadow of tragedy, continues to shape America's identity and choices. As the dust settled over Ground Zero, the immediate dangers of the attacks slowly gave way to another, quieter threat, one that would emerge over years and decades. For the thousands of survivors, firefighters, police officers, paramedics, and volunteers who worked amid the rubble, the air they breathed was thick with a toxic mix of dust, smoke, and chemicals. The debris contained asbestos, lead, concrete dust, and burning plastic sand, invisible cloud of poisons that seeped deep into lungs and body. In the weeks and months after 9/11, many began to experience symptoms that seemed unrelated to the attack's persistent coughs, shortness of breath, chronic fatigue, and strange rashes. Initially, these symptoms were dismissed by some as temporary but over time, the medical community recognized a growing pattern. A spectrum of illnesses now collectively called World Trade Center Health Syndrome began to affect thousands. Respiratory diseases like asthma and chronic bronchitis became common. Gastrointestinal problems, mental health conditions such as PTSD and depression, and even certain cancers emerged in higher numbers. First responders, many of whom had not worn protective masks during their heroic rescue efforts, bore the brunt of these effects. They had rushed into danger without knowing what invisible hazards awaited them. Now, many faced debilitating illnesses linked directly to their sacrifice. For survivors trapped in or near the towers, the exposure had lasting consequences. As the years passed, these health issues often worsened. The struggle to receive medical care, disability benefits, and government recognition became a new battlefield. Families and advocates fought tirelessly to convince lawmakers and agencies to acknowledge the scope of the problem. In 2010, the James Zadroga 9/11 Health and Compensation Act was passed, providing medical monitoring and financial aid to affected individuals. Yet even with such laws, many victims faced bureaucratic hurdles, skepticism, and delays. The health toll extended beyond the physical. Mental health struggles were pervasive. Survivors recounted nightmares of falling debris, screams, and the terrifying moments trapped or running through smoke-filled stairwells. First responders described flashbacks, anxiety attacks, and survivor's guilt. Support groups, counseling services, and specialized clinics formed to help those coping with these invisible wounds. Despite the challenges, the affected communities remained resilient. They advocated for awareness, research, and improved care. Memorials included dedications not only to those who died on 9/11, but also to those whose lives were forever changed by illness. Their stories remind us that the cost of tragedy is not confined to a single day. It stretches across lifetimes, and healing, though slow and often painful, continues. In the years following September 11th, the ways Americans learned about their country and the world began to change quietly but profoundly. Classrooms, libraries, and community centers became places where the memory of 9/11s was carefully woven into lessons and stories, not just as history, but as a touchstone of identity, resilience, and caution. Schools across the country introduced units about the attacks, terrorism, and their global aftermath. Teachers faced a delicate task balancing the need to explain a tragic event with sensitivity to young minds. They shared stories of heroism and loss, emphasizing values like unity, courage, and empathy. Textbooks began including new chapters on 9/11s and the War on Terror, ensuring that students understood how the attacks reshaped America's place in the world. Beyond history classes, discussions of security, civil rights, and diversity became more common. Students learned about the complex balance between safety and freedom, about the dangers of prejudice, and the importance of standing against discrimination. In many schools, September 11th became a day of remembrance. Students participated in moments of silence, wrote reflections, and sometimes invited survivors or first responders to share their stories. These rituals helped keep the memory alive and fostered a sense of community. At the same time, the media landscape evolved. News coverage adapted to the new realities of global terrorism. Channels dedicated extensive airtime to stories about security, policy changes, and personal accounts of those affected. Documentaries, films, and series about 9/11s and its aftermath found eager audiences, shaping public understanding. Social media, which rose to prominence in the following decade, played a unique role. It became a platform for sharing memories, supporting survivors, and debating the ongoing impact of 9/11s. Yet it also sometimes spread misinformation, underscoring the challenges of navigating truth in a connected world. Storytelling about 9/11s was not confined to schools and media. Books, music, theater, and art continued to explore its many. These stories, sometimes hopeful, sometimes painful, helped individuals process trauma and contributed to a collective memory. As time passed, new generations grew up with 9/11s as a historical fact. For some, it was a distant event, remembered through stories and lessons. For others, it was a personal family history, parents who lived through it, siblings who were born afterward. This duality shaped how America remembered and learned from that day. Education and storytelling became vital tools, not only for remembering but for understanding. They invited reflection on the past and cautious hope for the future. In the immediate aftermath of September 11th, as smoke cleared and the world watched in sorrow, the question arose: how would New York, and America as a whole, recover from such devastation? Ground Zero, the heart of the destruction, became both a graveyard and a symbol of resilience. The site, once occupied by the Twin Towers, was a vast void filled with twisted steel, ash, and memories. Clearing the rubble was a monumental task. Rescue workers, construction crews, and volunteers labored for months, sifting through debris to find survivors, recover remains, and prepare the land for a future yet unknown. This process was painstaking and painful. Every piece of steel, every shard of glass, carried stories of loss, heroism, and history. The world watched as the site evolved from a place of tragedy to one of reflection and hope. Planning the rebuilding was complex. Architects, city officials, families of victims, and the public all had a stake in what would rise from the ashes. Designs were proposed, debated, and revised. Some wanted a memorial that honored the dead with solemnity and silence. Others wanted to rebuild the skyline, signaling strength and progress. Ultimately, the project became a blend of both a memorial intertwined with new towers. The 9/11's memorial opened in 2011. Its two reflecting pools, tracing the footprints of the original towers, invited visitors to pause and remember. The sound of cascading water softened the city's bustle, creating a place of quiet contemplation. Nearby, One World Trade Center rose, a gleaming symbol of renewal, reaching higher than its predecessors, built with lessons learned from tragedy. Its design emphasized safety, strength, and sustainability. Yet the rebuilding was not just physical. It was emotional, political, and cultural. Families of victims advocated tirelessly for remembrance and justice. Survivors and first responders sought recognition for their sacrifices and struggles. The city grappled with the wounds that remained hidden beneath the surface. Through it all, Ground Zero became a place where grief and hope coexist. Visitors from around the world come to pay respects, to learn, and to reflect on resilience. The rebuilding reminded the nation that, even after the darkest days, renewal is possible. that healing is a journey, not a destination, and that remembering is an act of both mourning and courage. As the years unfold, the echoes of September 11th remain woven deeply into America's story. The attacks changed not only the nation's skyline, but also its sense of self. A new chapter began, one marked by resilience, reflection, and sometimes uncertainty. The trauma of that day shaped generations. Children born after 9/11 grew up in a world of heightened security and cautious optimism. Memories passed from parents to children kept the day alive in family stories and lessons. America's role on the world stage shifted. The fight against terrorism became a central focus of foreign and domestic policy. It brought both cooperation and conflict. Allies stood shoulder to shoulder in some battles, while disagreements and debates persisted in others. At home, the balance between safety and freedom remains a delicate dance. The government's expanded powers continue to spark conversations about privacy, civil liberties, and democracy. The nation still grapples with the consequences of war, the health toll on heroes, and the divisions sparked by fear and policy. Yet, through all the challenges, America's core values endure. The commitment to justice, to community, and to hope, the quiet acts of kindness seen on that fateful day. Strangers helping strangers, first responders rushing into danger, still inspire. Every year on September 11th, in moments of silence and remembrance, Americans honor the nearly 3,000 lives lost and reaffirm their collective spirit. The memorials, the stories, the art, all serve as reminders that even in the darkest times, light persists. The legacy of 9/11 is complex, woven with loss and love, fear and courage, grief and healing. It is a story of a nation forever changed, but still moving forward. And as the sun rises each day, America continues its journey, mindful of the past, attentive to the present, and hopeful for the future.